Thank you everyone for joining us. We do have a stellar team with us here today. Hello everyone and welcome to our next edition of Dialogue Sans Borders. Today is a conversation on social behavior, a conversation on the changing attitudes towards each other and societies, mental health, the new coping mechanisms, and the gender-based challenges that lie ahead of us. We have a fantastic mix of panel members today. So we've gone east to north, we've gone south, and we've gone, into a couple of cities in India as well. So welcome our panel today. Professor Dilip Menon, Mellon Chair of Indian Studies, Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, the University of Witwatersrand. Thank you, Dilip, for joining us from what appears to be, as you say, a freezing location back down in South Africa. So thanks for making the time to join us today. Dilip was educated at the universities of Delhi, Oxford, and Cambridge, and got his PhD from Cambridge. He's currently working on issues of cultural and intellectual history and is engaged in a project on the writing of history in India between 1850 and 1960. The work inaugurated at the center is interdisciplinary and transnational in approach and looks afresh at issues of knowledge, modernity, and migration in the global south. He has recently edited Capitalisms Towards a Global History for Oxford 2020 and another edited volume titled Concepts from the Global South in forthcoming from Oxford in 2021. Welcome, Dilip. We have from Sydney, Australia, Jill Bennett. Jill, again, thank you. It's late in the evening, 7:30 in your country, but thanks for taking the time to join us. Jill is Professor of Experimental Arts and the founding director of NIEA from the University of New South Wales. She's also an Australia Council for the Arts Fellow, and we are excited for Jill to join us as Krea has a fantastic relationship with the Australian Council for the Arts, which is an exchange of expertise agreement with the Australia Council. Associate Professor Jill Bennett is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow at the University of New South Wales, where she leads Field Experience and Empathy Lab, bringing together psychologists, creative practitioners, and community collaborators to study subjective experiences of mental, emotional health, and trauma, and to develop new forms of community-based psychosocial support. Jill is a writer, curator, and immersive media producer whose work includes arts-science collaborations at the intersection of trauma, psychology, and mental health, and the design of public engagement. Welcome, Jill. We have from UK, Glenn Williams. Glenn's joining us from the Nottingham Trent University. Glenn is Principal Lecturer from the School of Social Sciences. Glenn Williams currently oversees all developments in the psychology department relating to internationalization and employability, including providing work-based, work-relevant experiences for all psychology students. Dr. Williams has experience of working in the National Health Service as a research officer and also a research and development and clinical audit deputy manager. He has been involved in provision of training and education of qualified and trainee health professionals for many years through various teaching positions. Welcome, Glenn. Thanks for joining us. We have from Delhi, Soumya Kapoor, the head of IWWAGE. IWWAGE is the initiative for what works to advance women and girls in the economy. It aims at supporting solutions and policies through a multi-stakeholder platform using evidence and research to ensure economic empowerment for women in India. IWWAGE is housed at IFMR Lead at Krea and is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Soumya Kapoor leads IWWAGE's efforts to generate, leverage, and synthesize evidence on women's economic empowerment. She's worked as an independent policy advisor for the World Bank, UNICEF, the Government of India, the Center for Policy Research, and the Self-Employed Women's Association, helping these institutions mainstream inclusion and gender issues in their research and projects ranging from investments in women's collectives to sectors such as water, agriculture, infrastructure, urban development, environment, and climate change. Thanks, Soumya. Thanks for joining us. We have from Krea University, Srajana Kaikni, Assistant Professor of Philosophy. Gaining her PhD in philosophy from Manipal University, Srajana did her curatorial studies at the D. Apple's curatorial program in 2012-13 from Amsterdam. She was the collections curator at the KK Hebar Gallery and Arts Center. Her latest independent curatorial works include Backstage of Biology at Archives at National Center for Biological Sciences and Vectors of Kinship at 11th Shanghai Biennale. Her research interests include aesthetics, curatorial studies, arts, pedagogy, kinship and relations, philosophy of language, philosophy of art, image, cinema, and space. We couldn't have asked for a more diverse panel, both geographically as well as the areas of expertise. I now invite Mukund Padmanabhan, visiting professor of Krea University, and to moderate this panel and take forward the discussion over the next hour or so. Thank you, everyone, and welcome again to Dialogue Sans Borders.
Thank you, Kala. So, I think we'll kick off with the issue of mental health, and that's because one of the things that has struck me is how much the WHO has spoken about this issue over the last couple of months. I mean, over and over again. There's this policy brief that it's put out, which highlights the need to urgently increase investments in this area. And it's also predicted that a failure to do this will result in a massive spike in mental health conditions. And, this is a document that has case studies and then cites data from, countries as far-flung as Ethiopia, China, Canada, to say depression levels have hiked, alcoholism levels have spiked in many places. So my question is, apart from the usual things that governments are doing, testing, contact tracing, enforcing social distancing, ramping up public health infrastructure, should governments, the private sector, health professionals, NGOs, and even the public at large would be doing a lot more at this time to strengthen a sense of social interconnectedness, to reduce loneliness, particularly amongst the most vulnerable? And if yes, really, what specific forms should it take? I mean, in a time like COVID, I mean, how is it done? Phone calls, organizing online activities. What does one do? And I'd like, Jill, can you take that first? Start with you.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is probably not the obvious one, in that I'm not, a health economist, or I'm not even in the mental health sector per se. That said, I work very much in tandem with the mental health sector to try to develop approaches to reach those who, in fact, don't intersect with health services. So we are always going outside into, cultural and everyday spaces to engage with people, to evaluate needs in different ways, and usually from the ground up, looking at what people are experiencing and what's missing and what works, in fact, for them. Because this is one of the mysteries of mental health. We know that most people in any nation, you take as an example, who might say they have mental health concerns, the majority don't access formal services. So understanding those informal services and what works and what can be strengthened is really critical. And so I think there's a real chance with COVID not to just do the large scale rollouts of the most cost effective solutions, online CBT, visits to the GP, all of that's fine. It's kind of the low hanging fruit. It's in place anyway. What else can we do to strengthen community and, agency and social connectedness? And that's something that I think we need to do in a cross-sector way. And this is why I work at the intersection of arts and mental health and different kinds of social services, to really look at how we can develop supports within, say, the cultural sector. And I can talk in a bit more detail about how we do that, but I think it's a very broad-based, bottom-up, responsive approach, and not simply assuming that we've got the answers and we just need to extend standardized programs.
Okay, Glenn, what are the specific challenges in strengthening the sense of interconnectedness in the face of a pandemic like this?
Well, the specific challenges with regards to people's mental health and social connectivity, they're numerous, and they're primarily because we may be getting mixed messages from those experts. Primarily in the UK, we've had daily news conferences from those in the government and also the medical experts telling us about what we should or shouldn't be doing. And there are things like the physical distancing, which really we should think of it as physical distancing rather than social distancing, but the physical then starts to overlap with the social as well, unfortunately. And we may then start to see that anyone else outside of our bubble is potentially a threat because of this unseen pandemic. We have other pandemics as well, and they've been around for a long time, whether it's with regards to mental health distress that has been bubbling under, or many other. But the one thing I'd say is that the challenges are to help us to not see each other as threats. And I think that's the problem, is that we need to be able to create spaces for that to happen. And I really like what Jill has referred to in terms of more of from within the communities rather than something foisted onto people. And it needs to be intersectoral, as Jill has referred to, because this is not going to be a segmented problem that you can come with just one particular solution. So the challenges are very numerous. But one thing I would say is that it's been really encouraging to see how we have been quite adaptive. We have used technology within our own university to get our students to connect with us, and yet we're doing this primarily with the screen. And thankfully in the UK we're starting to dissolve the constraints up to a point, but there's still that caution. So we are from the 4th of July going to be able to go to museums, galleries, cinemas, and yet the funny thing is that we're still getting the message from the medical experts that the threat has not gone away. So one final thing I'd like to say is, unfortunately, people who've currently got mental health conditions, they might have them exacerbated. So if you think about someone who may have been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, or is moving towards that on that spectrum, may be experiencing again obsessions about how they may be affected by whatever's going on around them, and there'll be a lot of checking behaviour as well then, so the compulsive tendencies, and yet we're all being encouraged to be checking a lot of things, and it's all that juggling so many things and not knowing what to focus on. So I don't have a happy and easy answer to trying to create more connections and help us to feel safer. But one thing I'd say is that we need to learn to live with relative risk. By that I'm talking about understanding that anything has a risk. So we can't think in terms of absolute risk, that we can minimize that totally. But whatever we do when we're going out on the streets and we're mixing with people in shops, it's looking at, well, what are we doing to minimize that? But what are we doing to make connections with others as well? Unfortunately, with the use of masks, we're losing one of the ways in which we could potentially connect with others. And through, we're only then having to focus purely on their eyes, which is very difficult to do. We're starting to become almost anonymous on the streets if we're all wearing masks. So it may then dehumanize us. So all I'm saying is that we've got so many challenges, and if we're working with that intersectoral bottom-up approach that Jill's advocating, I think that is one of the key ways I would really be saying that we need to be doing it. It can't be legislated for, and I think we can carry on with the innovative ways that we've been using so far as well.
Srajana, you have something to say on this.
So, I mean, I am not a mental health expert as such, but I would like to augment what Jill and Glenn both said about mental health with a certain sort of a social health angle, trying to look at it, in a paradigmatic way, and also situated contextually. So, for example, what Jill was saying, that there are certain mental health infrastructures already in place, and the efforts in your context, for example, are to look at other ways, other sort of co-constitutive, sort of parallel ways of diffusing this sort of a straight line structure that is already in place. Whereas
we do have situations where those infrastructures are not in place. So I think, for example, in certain global south situations, the priorities might be very different in terms of this could be an occasion for us to institute those infrastructures in the first place. At the same time, balance it out by trying to, look at the larger paradigm of care. Care is coming into the foreground, and we do have feminist philosophies, thinkers talking about care in different paradigms in the health scenario, and caregiving as such. And so the kind of articulation of the paradigm of care in our everyday day-to-day life, the more we articulate it, the more we sort of recognize it in its different forms. We recognize the burdens of it, the labor of care, what we call the labor of care. And I think most of what we do are at all these intersectional work. Often because it is intersectional, there are no brackets to identify or define them. And I think a new paradigm of care could be, the more we talk about it in sort of paradigmatic ways, it will help us ease out the sort of tensions between the mainstream structures, the so-called medical structures of mental health, and the social structures of mental health. Because so that's exactly what we're trying to bridge here, right? So we have a communal way of being, a communitarian understanding of being. And what I do see from both your context is you trying to reach out of the mainstream sort of medicalization, trying to look at other ways of doing it. And whereas in certain contexts here, we might have other ways of doing it, but the recognition of it, recognition of it in a mainstream is absent. So I think I just wanted to highlight that irony, that dichotomy, and contextually how it plays out in different contexts. Yeah.
So since intersectionality is the buzzword now, I'm going to, and so anyone can comment on this. So Dilip, historian's view on this?
Well, actually, it's not so much about intersectionality, but I just wanted to pick up on some of the things that we've been talking about right now, because as the social media meme goes, we're all in the same ocean, though not in the same boat, right? And so what we're seeing here is a kind of very fragmented kind of relation to the very idea of solitude, a fragmented relation to the idea of effectivity, so that the fact of people being confined in a certain space on their own wasn't very evident as a lack of connectivity when they had the option of other bodies, to walk out onto the road, to be in a theater, to be in a mall. And just the presence of other bodies created a kind of sociality, right? To which this social media connectivity was added on. But when you're on your own in a space, the absence of bodies means that a Twitter account gives you little comfort. And this is something to think about when we think about the mediation of affect, and which relates to mental health, obviously. I mean, when are you truly alone? Are you truly alone? What does it mean to be truly alone? These have become very fundamental questions right now. But this leads us to a second thing where we tended to take the idea of society for granted, that we live in a society, but it's very clear that we don't. Because what has become very clear during COVID-19 is that you don't need a mask not to see somebody, right? I mean, we have abandoned huge swathes of the population. In India, for example, there are people even not paying their domestic workers during the period of the crisis because they feel that, well, they're not working, they won't be paid, industry has cut adrift labor, there's been the great abandonment of labor trekking a few thousand kilometers to get back home. And here again, questions of mental resilience become very important, because a lot of the discussions in the social media are about boredom and solitude, where people are thrown on themselves. And here you have people who showed an extraordinary mental resilience in being cut adrift from the very means of subsistence, and who are trekking these great distances, joining their families, creating communities in the space of travel and so on. Right, so that's again something to think about as to this question of mental resilience and where it resides and who's able to summon it up. And it's not very obvious that those with cultural capital like ours have greater resources of mental resilience than those who are poor. And a final point, when we think about what are we going to do next in terms of public health, is what it's very, very clear right now that public health systems are collapsing, right? That governments are not invested in public health. And what we have really is, if you think about the idea of pastoral care, which Foucault talked about, that states have moved towards a management of population, what we have right now is performative. Politics has become merely performative. We've seen this in England, we've seen this in the United States, you've seen this in India, where it's not about creating structures of care within a system of crisis, it's just a abandonment. When you think about the fact of herd immunity, for example, it's basically what the philosopher Esposito called thanatopolitics, a politics of death. You basically, it's a Malthusian principle. Those who will survive, those who won't. And then we'll get on with life. So I think there's a whole cluster of issues here around mental health, which we can unpack, but I'll stop there for the moment.
Soumya, you want to jump in on this, or any particular point you want to talk about?
Oh, sure, Mukund. I think I'm not a mental health expert, but I mean, one of the things that we've been doing work on and researching on in terms of women is everybody talks about the rising burden of unpaid care that's come on women. The kids are not going to school, you need to take care of them. You are usually not calling your staff onto work, and therefore you're also cooking and cleaning. And this is, of course, a very urban picture. If you think about rural areas, as Dilip said, you're actually walking back home. Women who were used to staying alone now have their migrant husbands back home. There is no food on the table. There's great amount of anxiety in the household. Stress levels are high. And so you see news reports of what they're calling a shadow pandemic of domestic violence, because, the stresses come out, against women. But I think one of the other, besides that challenge of domestic violence and the stresses around, unpaid care, I think the other thing that gets doubly compounded for women is because they are the ones who, for example, the Prime Minister may announce that you can get free rations. Who's actually going to go to the PDS shop to fetch these rations? Now you have many people who are back home who used to be away for 6 months in a year doing construction labor at some work sites. Who's going to go and fetch water? So it's a lot of additional physical stress, which adds to these sort of mental issues. And I think one of the things which India did well over almost 3 decades was to collectivize women into self-help groups, and they used to serve as the solidarity channels. We've heard, in his, historical accounts of how anti-alcohol movements were fought, or caste, upper castes, like Dalit women walking in solidarity against higher caste in higher caste localities in places like Tamil Nadu or in Andhra Pradesh. And what you find is that those networks of solidarity, as Glenn and Jill were talking about, are broken because you cannot visit your neighbor's house. How do you bring these women who've been living together for decades, in a group setting where they are able to even talk about their problems? They are not going to pick up a 181 helpline and say, my husband's being abused. They would probably just talk to a neighbor and try and get some sort of comfort. So I think what the crisis and the solitude that the crisis brings about doubly impacts women because, they do not have those channels of solidarity, which is usually talking to friends and talking to neighbors and these groups available to them. And a final point on the intersectionality is that there is something that is also that this crisis has brought about, which perhaps it was always there, but it's come up again, which is the issue of stigma. And earlier the stigma was associated with, you're in India, for example, you're belonging to a lower caste, or you're belonging to a minority religion. Suddenly, oh my God, this guy has COVID. And, a particular minority religion community should not be, women from this community should not be fetching water at the communal hand pumps because they may be actually spreading COVID. So the intersectionality doubly compounds the issue of stigma around. And that's something that has added, to another level of stress. That stigma was perhaps something that Dalit activists and people had fought against for decades, and suddenly COVID has brought this issue of touch and this as being very important, and somehow raised that stigma again. So I'll stop here for now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had a question on COVID and women for you later, but I think you answered a part of it already. Glenn, you have your hand up. Yeah.
Yes, I just listening to what my fellow panelists are sharing. It's inspiring to see the way in which there's this convergence in understanding, and there are some really good ideas shared with regards to intersectionality. But the tragedy of this current situation is, as has already been highlighted by Soumya and Dilip, a number of things. The stigma I do associate with, from a social psychological angle. There's this, we have continually over several years, and in the UK I've noticed this, is that we've had this politics of otherness. Anyhow, we've been very divided since the Brexit vote. Anyhow, but we see this in other countries, and that this creation of an other group has been around for some time. But now, as has already been identified, it's been further compounded with regards to this pandemic. And so we don't have an easy way of resolving this. Ideally, we need to be focusing on the creation of being in it together. But I really like the example that Dilip used with regards to not being in the same boat. And the other thing I'd like to connect with from listening to Dilip's share is this thing about the presence of others. Just on a personal level, I find it quite enjoyable to just go to a nearby coffee shop, just sit there, drink a coffee, and just soak up the atmosphere of others being around me. But I would imagine for many of us, we've not had that experience recently, and it's something that we might then very much miss. This thing about solitude, I liked what Dilip was focusing on with regards to solitude, as opposed to perhaps feeling lonely. They are two different dynamics. Yes, they might overlap. But the final thing, and both Soumya and Dilip have inspired me, is this hearing about this focus on touch. And as a psychologist, I can say that this is something that is very interesting, that some people would be very touch aversive anyhow, and others will crave touch. And just to say on a personal level, I grew up in Johannesburg, and so I know a little bit about Wits University, where Dilip is based. And as a youngster growing up, we were very tactile with our friends. You know, we all had to be quite close by. And when I migrated back to the UK, I found that there was very much a physical distance as well. And so for me, I found it very difficult, craving touch and not getting it. And because people might maybe misconstrue it, because you have to think about what's the norm within that social situation. And the one thing I'd say, going back to my discipline of psychology, is that touch, the good thing about it is that creates some sort of flooding of the brain of the hormone of oxytocin. And oxytocin is actually this hormonal social glue. We feel more bonded to people when we are close by and touching them. And yet the sad thing is that with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've found that we cannot touch, and we're being barred through the medical profession from doing so. And it's not just distance. So we would find that those who are in hospital or in a care home, relatives would want to go and visit. And even if they're all geared up with PPE, this equipment to presumably protect them from this unseen enemy, when they're trying to touch their relatives who probably have only got a very short period left of their lives, the touch is not the same. It's through material. So that's going back to my point earlier on about tragedy. We're currently going through this, and we don't have an easy resolution to that. So we can come up with creative ways of psychologically feeling connected, but physically don't have that at the moment.
Okay, since I've got raised hands, Dilip and then Sajana. Okay.
Actually, this question of touch is central. We tend to take it for granted. I mean, as Glenn points out, and we are tactile in our friendships, we're tactile in our relationships with people, you know, a hand on the shoulder and so on. But when you think about societies like India, where touch is forbidden. The reason why Indians worship cricket is nobody has to touch each other. Football is not our national game. We are a society founded on caste and on distance and so on and so forth. So this question of touch during the time of COVID has become exacerbated, right? So it actually brought it more to the forefront. We are a society which is in India, which is not premised on touch, it's premised on distance. So that's something to think about, because we already also think about the medical profession in India, right? Where it's largely, if you think about the nursing profession, it's largely Christians who are part of the nursing profession, coming from Kerala, coming from the Northeast, because Hindus are averse to touching bodies that are not within an existing hierarchy. And so we've seen in India too a lot of attacks on, in North India, on nurses who come from the Northeast because they look different, nurses who come from South India because they are, anyway, there are these hierarchies of color, darker people in the South and so on. So suddenly COVID has brought to the forefront many of these things which were submerged. The inequalities, the hierarchies, the prejudices that were submerged are surfacing, and we've seen this in attacks, more obviously on Chinese, on subway trains in the US and so on. So I think that's something worth thinking about, because the second aspect of COVID is about breathing, right? We all take breath for granted, and somehow breath is something that seems to be challenged right now. And for me, it's hugely significant that when George Floyd dies saying, "I can't breathe," it touches a chord across the world in a way that it hadn't done earlier, right? When you think about the fact that the number of Black men who have been murdered by police, Errol Garner, whose last words are also, "I can't breathe," but somehow George Floyd's words, "I can't breathe," touches a chord in the time of COVID, because that's what we are struggling with, what we took for granted all along. Yeah. So I think these sensory things are things we're thinking about: touching, breathing, seeing, mask, as Glenn pointed out. So these might be things we're thinking with.
Yeah, Sajna, I mean, you want to respond to that? India being a society where there's less touch, I thought in many respects the converse was true. I can understand how it plays out in terms of caste in some ways, but we are extremely tactile in other ways.
Only within caste, not across caste. We don't even marry people of other castes.
Not sure. Anyway, go on.
Perhaps we might need a little bit of nuancing in the idea of India as a culture and the notion of touch, because I mean, I would also sort of like try to think that touch is sort of like a more easy sensory experience of like so-called Indian social, if we were to have anything of that, which is then sort of there's a gatekeeping process for this touch within the caste system. That's true. So, I mean, but we do have communities outside of the Hindu community constituting India. So we might want to problematize and sort of expand this notion of India being Hindu and therefore caste-ridden. But I mean, having said that, caste system is the bane of our social. So we have to really address that in a particular way. But just looking at this whole idea of touch, I recalled an anecdote I was sharing with one of my colleagues the other day. I was saying, like, we have become like a big museum, wherein each of us is a museum object with a do not touch sign, you know. So it's like a fantasy imagination for a curator. But then also looking at the primacy of experience playing out in all this. So there is a constant tussle or reaching out for a loss of experience, a sensory experience. So I'm trying to foreground this whole COVID as something that has been overtaken by a flood of knowledge. So there's social media that is sort of constantly flooding us with knowledge, information, statistics, data, because there is the race for innovation, the race for research is going on. But at the same time, what I feel is that it is not sort of the experience angle of COVID. So what are the experiences of this pandemic? And that's why it's interlinked with the mental health aspects. So mind and experience, we're trying to look at singular individual experiences, representable experiences, non-representable experiences, and the mediation of it per se. And that's why, like when Dilip was talking about solitude and resilience in a very secluded, suddenly we imagine one person in his or her environment, and that sort of is very different from that person as a number, right? So the reduction of lives into numbers and statistics, that is itself a strange sort of subterranean violence going on, I think, in our experience. The ideas like Zoom fatigue, it's a very different sensory world that we are trying to encounter and navigate. And I mean, I just like to like push at that again, saying, I mean, what does this do? And when we try to resuscitate experiences, then the notion of ethics comes into ethical mediation of these comes to the foreground. Numbers commonsensically can do away with ethics. So the notion of ethics keeps, I think, needs a really like a major foregrounding in this, where because experiences are needing voicing, experiences are needing articulation. And recently I was seeing how, I think some weeks ago, the social media of the BBC feed, what they've done is initially there is a lot of feed of individual stories. So people with their selfie cameras, they're taking their own, daily COVID diaries format of documenting their lives and experiences. And then, the selfies and the video vlogs are coming up and such. And what the BBC did is they started sharing animated versions of these life experiences. So they started animating certain stories in a sort of a color format, So animation became sort of and I'd like to see that as a very chosen choice aesthetic, which is trying to mediate a certain unrepresentability of experiences of suffering or trauma. So where, where when you try to represent a real life, personal, intimate aspect of somebody's suffering, a moment of death, a moment of crisis, the sort of voyeurism that this world now is giving to us directly, very easily and freely, I think to mediate or mitigate that voyeurism, we need certain sort of new forms of, ethics. And that's why, I mean, remember speaking to Jill the other day, creative engagement, that becomes one way of trying to sort of slightly, engage with something, to try to just be with it, but not do something with it, right? So the rush with statistics, numbers is you have something, you do something with it. Data, there is a lot of data, and you sort of like, so I mean, that's a lot of stuff. I just sort of like laid out the ground, but wanting to try to push this into a larger sort of paradigm of experience versus knowledge, and how this is sort of like reshaping in our current context.
So, I mean, okay, you briefly alluded to the notion of the arts, and I think that's something we need to discuss. I mean, the idea that, creativity and the arts play an important role in mental health is now sort of, it's received opinion, widely accepted. And obviously, the role for something like this only gets magnified in the face of a pandemic like COVID-19. So, Jill, since you referred to this as well, take us through what many see as this kind of enlarged role for arts and creativity in this particular crisis. And I'll tag a second question along with that for anyone who wants to answer it. While mental health professionals, NGOs, others routinely use the word arts and creativity when talking about mental health conditions, I mean, to help manage them, to protect against them, to strengthen mental health recovery, and so on. I just find the expression is used somewhat loosely. I mean, it refers to a range of things. On one spectrum, you have such things like music, painting, literature, and so on, where, words like arts and creativity, are closely associated with, at least in popular parlance. And on the other hand, many other things are tagged along, such as cooking, being a part of a dance group, or gardening.
Yeah.
So my second question is arts and creativity just merely a euphemism for some kind of group activity? Or are we actually saying that, you know, a sort of special form of creativity does play a role in mental health? So two questions.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that both are true. You know, all the discussions I've heard around this reference different sort of constructs of art. So you have this idea of art as a distraction, art as a mindful activity, which it is, but you know, then it's the same as any other mindful focused activity, which might be good for you, but that doesn't particularly you know, capitalize on the, you know, the real capacities of creative thought. To me, what you would go to the arts for is a much deeper engagement with mental distress and emotional life. And I think, as is also true, that many people intuitively do that in their selection of kind of reading materials and viewing materials. I mean, it is where we learn about human emotion and relationships beyond our immediate physical circumstances. So then I would want to extend that and say, you know, we can deploy the arts more programmatically in terms of actually thinking about our well-being. So to go back to the discussion where it left off, we were talking about those moments of anxiety around loss of touch, or Glenn mentioned the interesting example of the face masks and how then we might panic because we're losing some social cues and not connecting. But you know, there's always a flip side to this, and the interesting thing there is it's very kind of normative, and it's easy to think, oh my God, we've lost this key channel, you know, panic. But that's where we want to do the work around sensory and affective experience, I think, because what I immediately came to my mind then was the cultural issue around the burqa, and you know, the race-based panic about, you know, we can't see a woman's face. And suddenly then, you know, everybody's wearing masks. We actually have to learn to look at eyes. And there are many cues. You know, we communicate in a multimodal way. Even if the face was totally covered, we can have an emotional interaction. And I think actually, you know, we can learn a lot from, you know, people with different sensory experiences, autistic people who are much more attuned to other cues and are actually overwhelmed by gushy, emotive, you know, touch-based communications often. And so I think that a sort of assumption that this is how we communicate, we've lost it, we're in trouble, you know, panic and anxiety, that's maybe where the work needs to occur. So enriching of sensory capacity, attunement, noticing, and, you know, these all underpin skills of empathy, which we need to actually address problems of stigma, which is just about sort of instant judgment, closing down, rather than being able to relate in adaptive ways to people who are people or situations that are unfamiliar to us. So that's a large part of the project, I think, for arts and, you know, communications that are focused on, yeah, these aesthetic modes of transaction, you know, I mean, literally the sensory affective channels of communication.
Glenn, do you want to come in on this, Glenn?
Oh, your microphone's
Dilip wants
off.
to say something actually. So sorry,
Yeah.
Sorry, Joe.
No, sorry, I was. I think did Strajana want to say something?
Oh, as well. Apologies.
I thought.
Several people, not just me.
Yes, a bit of confusion here. Yeah, talk about reading the social cues. This is a Zoom moment.
Yeah, so
I'm just going to add to what Jill said
Yeah.
about like the potential of
Yeah.
creativity and the arts, because I'm very curious, and I know that there is a lot of potential there. And trying to look at, again, same thing, I'd like to foreground that I think what artists do, or what artists sort of become for, like, they observe or safeguard or just engage with or try to remember, recall experiences. And I think the aesthetics and the experiential aspect of our lives is safeguarded by the arts, just like the knowledge aspect of our lives, if I would just like very grossly bifurcate it, is safeguarded by the sciences. We have arts trying to safeguard experiences, trying to propagate sort of voice experiences. And like, I mean, there are strategies, artistic strategies that are being used by artists to counter traumatic narratives in the context of Holocaust, in the context of genocide, intergenerational trauma, racism. For example, we were discussing the other day the strategy of counter memorialization. It's an idea which Foucault brought in, the counter memorial. It's trying to look at not the monumentalization of tragedy, but trying to safeguard the very unrepresentable idea of something which is, which happens or goes through during suffering and trauma. And so counter monumentalization is basically where, and often artists have used the strategies post the Holocaust, so in Germany, but also currently we see some monuments in the US mostly, I think, because it's like still in the global north that is being done. That these are small monuments. These are not big monuments, if I may say so. They are memorials, but they are in a different way. They're diffused. So artists are engaging with communitarian projects. They're running radio labs. They're going into the ground and trying to just be with communities and just documentations. The other major form that came up in the last decade is record keeping and documentation strategies. So artists primarily considering themselves as documenters of life, just witness figures, not doing anything, not being there, not bringing about, so, but just looking at what's going on and bringing that to the fore. And so we have currently a lot of online platforms which are sort of using that strategy, right? Like the People's Archive of Rural India and those kinds. So trying to just foreground stories, keeping a record of it, and then we can figure out what to do with it. But just by doing that, we have, like, I mean, I think artists give a strategy of just, again, I keep, because connecting to the behavioral part, before we behave, it's important to know how to be in a very larger sense. So I think arts gives us a way to be with something. Let's talk about behaving eventually. So
right.
yeah.
So let's just, I mean, we just have a few minutes more, so I just want to toss this around. So if you can just be brief. Soumya, I'm going to come to you now. Yeah. Soumya?
Yeah. So I think in terms of touch, one of the other issues, which again, I'm going to speak from a gender lens, is that if you think about it, a lot of the sensory sort of occupations also, I wouldn't say completely, but in a majority sense seem to be done by women. So for example, you know, the stitching, the sewing, the caring, the tending, the masseurs, the sex workers. I mean, these are communities which, because IWWAGE also is looking at the economic impact that it would have, is these are communities which may be affected for a very long term. I mean, one of the professions that urban Indian women, because, you know, they want to work, you know, part-time or maybe take up some part-time jobs so that they can also work, you know, attend to their domestic responsibilities, is say on gig platforms. So there is a service called Urban Clap, where people would, now the Urban Company, where these women would enroll and provide beauty salon services. That's about 80% of Urban Clap's business. It's completely shut down. Millions of women have lost their jobs. I mean, this would have been a perfect part-time job to do. And it's extremely difficult to fathom when they will be able to go with the PPM mean, nobody would invite them into their homes for a salon service, even if they're wearing a PPE kit. So I think the sensory sort of occupations and how they are led by women are also going to have a deeper economic impact. And I think the second in terms of solutions, I mean, things that we have been talking about is, so IWWAGE does some gender trainings, and it's become extremely difficult because you cannot, I think it goes back to Sarchana's point about ethics. You can't pick up the phone and, have an IVRS very, non-personal sort of call, impersonal call, which goes and says, you need to do this, you need to maintain social distancing, what are the sort of problems you're having. You're basically violating ethics in a way that you're putting more burden on her. So how do you, so we do gender trainings, but, how do you pivot gender trainings? Even as, India or other countries start to recover, particularly for women. And it has to start really from, stage zero for them, more so than men. And I think, just to give you an example, the government keeps talking about, oh, we need to build their livelihoods. And, particularly in rural areas, we need to start working on the farm sector. In the case of women, you first have to make her realize that you are a farmer. You also have an identity as a farmer. You're not just an unpaid helper working on the family farms. So I think, mentally, even the sort of solutions that are offered first need to have a mental switch, more so for women, because they start thinking, oh, this is something that I need to start integrating in my identity, that I also work on the farms. I also contribute, to an economic output. And those are the sort of mental solutions that I think even need to be spoken about when you're talking about economic recovery packages. So I'll keep it short, Mukund, because time's, yeah.
Okay, any other point about creativity, arts, and mental health, which was the original question? Sorry, Glenn, yeah.
So what I'd like to do is try and complement what's already been shared. The thing that I've struggled with sometimes, I've worked with people who do community arts projects, I've worked with art therapists, and as already has been shared, there's this idea of art as distraction, or art as therapy, or whether it's some sort of prescribed art therapy that could help with the management of emotions. I remember working with colleagues that are in the role of counsellor or psychotherapist, and they may find that art through non-verbal means can be really good outlets in terms of certain things cannot be put into words. And so that's one thing I'd like to flag up, is that in a way it's trying to allow us again to connect in ways that may be very difficult, because the easy way to connect might be to just talk things through, but many people might not find that very easy to do. The other thing I'd like to say is arts. It was interesting to listen to Srajana's share with regards to memorializing or some sort of counter mechanism there, is that we may find that art is being created at this moment in time with some sort of a way of expressing some sort of collective distress and saying enough, something has to change. So we see very recently now with the killing of George Floyd and with other events that have occurred as well within the USA, murals seem to be something that are quite common in that respect. And I remember finding out more about mural projects that are done in certain parts of the USA where there is actually funding to support this creation of street art. And there was one particularly looking at suicide and helping those to give thanks to those who whose lives have touched other people's lives, because the mural is actually for those who are lost to suicide, and so that mural was created by those who've been bereaved through those acts. And so in a way it was a way to go back and to have some sort of way of creating. And that the mural was very interesting in that it was a one where these, going back to the lifeboats analogy, where it would be these people whose images would be on the wall, and the life preserver, as I think you call it in America, would be thrown out to those people, and it'd be a way of thinking, well, is there anything else we could have done? But that is being done in a creative way to flag that up. And the one thing I'd like to say though as well, it's not just the mural, but other static products. And so one thing we've found again more recently is the creation of statues, which are now being seen as heresy, in terms of there being almost like straw men that need to be burnt, knocked down, defaced, whatever it is. And so in a way, we're talking about arts as a way of creating something from nothing, or from some sort of idea, a little germinating idea that then we think, well, what can we do with this? But things have been created and they are no longer seen as legitimate. And I'm not necessarily saying from an observer's point of view whether that's right or wrong. It's more a case of perhaps for some people it's collective grieving, but others it's trying to say, look, we need to have something to change. We need to make sure that our value systems and the way in which we see the world are radically shaken up. So arts could be a really great way to do that. But again, it's going back to my points much earlier on about being creative, looking at the ways in which we can connect with each other, primarily through technology and so on. So those would be the things I'd like to share in regards to the arts.
Dilip, I know you have your hands up, but Glenn talked about statues and contested histories and so on. And I just wonder, whatever else you have to say on the subject about arts, whether you can touch also on this idea about COVID-19 and polarization. Has this actually, there's some examples where it's helped to bring people together in some ways, but has it also polarized countries in sort of, ways, even greater, in much sharper ways than existed before? And our statues and protests and other forms of activity and greater hostility on social media platforms, all a reflection. I mean, have they got anything to do with the pandemic as well, or is this just business as usual?
Yeah, I think that there's something interesting that's happening at this moment, which is related to the idea of history and the individual, because one of the things is that when we speak about individuality, where does individuality lie? And more people, even in this discussion, we've been talking about how individuality lies in the face. Does it lie in the fingerprint, in the iris, and the face? And if you're visually challenged, what does it mean to say, well, we can no longer see somebody, right? If your condition was of not being able to see the face, but to recognize through voice, the timbre of a voice, the odor of a person, and so on and so forth. So I think in some sense, we are being very conventional in the ways in which we understand what individuality is. And the mask, actually, if you are visually challenged, a person having a mask or not having a mask makes little difference. So what this COVID-19 has done is to actually provide us with a sense of a very fragmented landscape, a landscape that is fragmented by power, a landscape that is fragmented by biographies. And to go back to Srijana's point about, it's not aggregations of people, it's not Indians, but Indians are divided. It's not the United States, e pluribus unum, the fact that it's divided by race, those kinds of questions. So when you think about that, that's really why these questions of a contestation of history is coming up, and the statues are being challenged, monuments are being challenged, narratives of unity are being challenged, because it's very clear during COVID-19 that the nation as such is not pulling together, that some people are being abandoned, some people are surviving. Jeff Bezos has emerged as the richest human being ever in the history of humankind. So he's okay, thank you. But the rest of us are kind of scattered. So I think it's a total fragmentation that's happened with COVID, which has exposed the fault lines of power.
Yeah.
right? Expose the fault lines of power, not only between the able and the not able, but within the able themselves, questions of touch, which you've spoken about, who can touch, who cannot touch. So I think this question of the statue then becomes a condensation of that fragmentation, right? Saying that there can be no one image that can stand in for a history, that the histories are fragmented and as they were in the past, and continue to do so in the present. And I think that's where it's interesting, where we need to think about this. And the final point about art, I think when we think about art, artists and so on, we need to go to TikTok right now, right? And we are too obsessed with the idea of the aura of art, because people are producing in solitude. People are cooking new dishes, they're evolving new dance moves, they're putting it all out there. And this is where we shall have to look at, because if we have to have a new democratic imagination emerging after COVID, right? It will not be in statues. Look to TikTok rather than to the statues is what I would say. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. On that note, I'm going to look to Kala because I think our time's up, and maybe we can just go over to the question segment. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Pukun. Thanks, everyone. Yes, as we planned, it was just some general perspectives and have some thoughts around. Taking from what Dilip had just last said, and this is to Jill, how is the crisis going to have an impact on the creative living at large, or is this a temporary coping strategy? And this question comes from Sam. And he asked, generally, most people are passive consumers of art rather than actual creators. But in this crisis, many people have gone to look inwards, to revisit the roots and create. And hence the question about, are we going to see an impact on creative living at large, or is this just temporary?
Yeah, I think, part of the problem is that we do frame art in this rarefied way as product. And then people think, well, what is it to engage in the arts? Is to develop some skill, which may be just frustrating because if you can't draw, you can't draw. But really what you're describing, when you say look to TikTok, not to statues, what's really implied there is the capacity to operate within an aesthetic modality. And I think that we, philosophy has been, there is this enduring sense of the aesthetic, not as, related to the judgment of taste, but simply as the kind of sensory affective modality and means of connection. And that is, it's kind of more common in psychotherapy to talk about that in terms of, the kind of touch relationship that develops in when we're babies, and the importance of that for any kind of emotional development. But actually that's rarely taken up in the philosophical discourse around aesthetics, let alone the kind of popular discourse. So I think that's something we do, and often something we do intuitively, and sometimes do really well in, if we're, have a channel on YouTube or, TikTok or whatever. And it is quite, widely available, and it is, to go back to my previous point, the way that we can actually deal with anxiety and develop, it's fundamental to emotional growth. And I think that perhaps if we had a more of a grasp, more of a sense of how we can do this, rather than it being just something that's beyond our reach or that other people do, I think that's a really valuable development within the discourse of art and aesthetics.
Anybody has anything to add to that in terms of this? Rajna, you want to add, is this going to have an impact on our creative living at large, or do you think it's temporary?
I'd like to look at creative process as a process. It's an eternal process. Maybe they coagulate as moments. They coagulate as intense critical moments where we see a lot of it, but I am sure people have been expressing for centuries and will continue to do so. Yeah. Whether it is help for coping or not, that is where it is contextual. So.
Soumya, this question comes to you, and this was something, as part of our the form that we circulated, had some questions out. So how do you see this for just the initiatives that IWWAGE has run, and how much do you see this this period as a setback, and where is that going to be, and how do you think you're going to look at this post-COVID? Has this changed the way you look at structuring some of your initiatives within IWWAGE?
I think it's been a huge learning curve for us, Kala. So for all the setbacks that I mentioned in terms of domestic violence, or the increased drudgery, and also the increased burden of unpaid work, and intersectionality is making it worse, particularly for Muslim women, or women who are belonging to, say, any other Dalit community, etc., with the burden of stigma. Actually, women across, I can speak for India at least, women across India have also emerged as the resilient sort of champions. For example, if you think about it, India never went dry for masks. There were masks in plenty. There were sanitizers that were always available, whereas other countries, there was reportedly a shortage. And that was because, the self-help groups that I was talking about, which are about 60-70 million women aggregated into federations, there were these WhatsApp videos which were circulated by the government, material was supplied to them, and overnight you had millions of masks which were available and came to the cities and even in villages. I think in other places too, when migrants have returned home, it is the women who are really feeding the quarantine centers. So where do the community kitchens, the food comes from? So it's really, again, the women who are working on this. And IWWAGE works a lot with these SHG collectives, and our experience across states suggests that one of the bare things that are missing in this, of course India has a notoriously bad public health infrastructure, but one of the things which you think about is we don't have barefoot functionaries. Actually, these women have served as barefoot functionaries. They give you the data and the knowledge. Okay, these many migrant families have returned to our village. It gets aggregated into the government database. They are the ones who are actually spreading messages about social distancing, etc. But they are the ones who are still, these SHG leaders are still the ones who are available in case somebody needs some help on a domestic violence issue. So in a way, they have served as a barefoot functionary, where even though, they weren't being paid for it. So I think it's been a lesson for us as well in terms of how, how women can also be more resilient in the face of these crises. And I think the reason I brought out intersectionalities was, but at the same time, there are some women who are particularly vulnerable, like the migrant women who used to work in construction labor sites have walked back home. They don't know what to do. There are domestic workers who've been fired by their employers and they're back home, say in tribal states like Jharkhand, they don't know what to do. There are sex workers who are going back into the villages after 10, 15 years. And, because they clearly know that this industry will not thrive. And, so there are vulnerable groups who we see as particularly challenging.
Thank you. Glenn, this question is more for you in terms of just the behaviors itself. With the change in behaviors, will the attitudes to risk change? So are we going to become more risk averse from here? And even in your less in the university, you're seeing now parents taking, families taking decisions. So do you see this as a challenge, this crisis actually change the way that communities or individuals will address risk in their personal lives?
Sorry, Kala, I missed a little bit of that question. You were saying about, if I can summarize, I think you were saying something about will attitudes to risk change, and also then will our subsequent behaviors change? Is that what you...
That's right. So is this going to change the way we look at risks, and as individuals or as groups, as families, as communities, our attitudes to taking risk?
Yes, unfortunately, that, I say unfortunately, but this is going to presumably be a reality regardless of this current pandemic. It's possible we may get other pandemics too, so this might make us more resilient on a collective level for generations to come. But in terms of attitudes and then subsequently behaviours, it has unfortunately led to entrenched attitudes at times where there's that lack of willingness to then interact with others at all, to even go out the house. So for someone who experiences agoraphobia as a day-by-day experience, then this is not going to help them at all. And so therapeutic work with that person is going to be even harder. So that's at the extreme end of the spectrum. But on our day-to-day and practice of our behaviours, we're having to formalise new behaviours. So the UK has been very good for many generations of having a queuing culture. I think perhaps we would win Olympic gold medals, or at least be silver or bronze. We're very good at queuing. And even nowadays, though, I realise just going out on the streets, visiting a shop, there'll be that tension because we've only just recently had the announcement that we're going to reduce down to 1 metre physical distance as per WHO guidance. But in the past, we've had 2 metres, which actually probably for some feels like even that is too close. But even if we have even if we have markings in rooms within shops or outside of the street to go into those shops, these markings flagging out that sort of distance, we're having to continually be aware of the boundaries placed upon our behaviour. So that will lead to people being getting more aggravated because you might have someone who's in a rush and who then goes, well, actually, I need to get in front of you. You're going to get some very interesting ways of turn taking with the informal behaviours in the way in which we navigate risk and then our subsequent behaviour. But yes, the funny thing as well is that those who work in the National Health Service have been venerated. So within the UK, we had, I think it was around 9 weeks, on every Thursday evening, there would be people going out on the streets and clapping the NHS staff or other care staff working in sort of like the care homes and thanking them for the great work that they've done. And the interesting thing is that you're talking about risk and behaviour. Some shops would then give preferential treatments in regards to those staff, so that if you're an NHS worker, you've got people who are queuing to go into the shop, that would be a kind of a speedy a track through so that you can actually get in the shop sooner than other people. So that again might cause resentment, and yet we've got the double blow, which is that actually I shouldn't feel resentment because they're getting this preferential treatment, but I'm so pleased that they're helping our families. So we're going to continually get these contradictions in our social lives for quite a few years to come, and until we get the vaccine, whatever that wonderful thing will be, we're going to have to keep trying to manage these uncharted territories through formal and then also these informal structures and procedures and things that we then start to take for granted again. So it's funny, a final point I want to make, and then I want to pass back to Krea. The point I'd say is that we keep using these phrases of new normal. The funny thing is that the old normal was an old normal only a few years ago, and then we had another old normal. Technology has made it so that we keep having many old normals. And I don't know whether or not the new normals that we're going to be looking forward to will be the ones that we should be embracing. I do want to take up on Jill's point very early on in our conversation that we need to think about whether we can have more bottom-up creation of whatever it is, but hopefully these new normals will be from us rather than from on high.
Mm-hmm. Dilip, you wanted to add something?
Yes, actually, when you ask this question about risk, again, we must not fall into the trap of thinking that there's some generalizable notion of risk. Like even when we talk about the NHS, it's those of British and minority ethnicity who are attending to patients who've been more at risk. Think about the laborers who were cut adrift in India, right? a lot of them went back, trekking back home, but they're willing to take the risk to come back again and live in precarious conditions. So I think risk is something that we need to understand in a much more disaggregated fashion, and not extrapolate from our experience where we have the choice of doing this or not doing this and so on. So I just wanted to put that out there. Just as much as I said, with the facial mask, we say, we can no longer see the face. And when somebody who is visually challenged, that's not the issue here, right? So I think we need to disaggregate all these responses. Otherwise, we shall probably fall back into conventionalities.
Fair enough. Thank you so much. I think that's just a lot of conversations packed. And as we said, this is about having conversations from different perspectives. And, all of you in your different stream, we've kind of navigated around the mental health, the touch, and how I think the very topic of touch and your different practices and how they've impacted was pretty interesting for me, just sitting here observing that we just got 25 minutes talking about touch across arts, across psychology, the gender issue, communities, individuals, so which is actually quite interesting from where this takes. And thank you so much once again for joining this. And this initiative is about bringing these perspectives out and making them more conversations for future micro groups that we can actually have some of these conversations around. I'd like to thank the Australia Council for the Arts, Nottingham Trent University, our partners to Krea, and we look forward to more work with you. Thanks, Dilip. You of course have an engagement with Krea. We're looking forward to more from you. Soumya and Strajana, thanks for being part of the team and putting it out there, flying the Krea flag. And Mukund, as always, thank you so much. And everybody who's joined us here, thanks for joining in. We'll see you in our next panel, which is on sustainability, another huge topic around the climate and environment that we'll touch on at the crisis. So thanks once again, everyone, and have a good evening.